Frank Biamonte. Where am I from? FBI, School of Operational Medicine. Good to see everybody, so to speak, again. Hope you're all well. This is going to be part 2 of endocrinology. In the last video, we discussed the anatomy and physiology of endocrinology. We talked about the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid, so on and so forth. We're going to spend the vast majority of this video talking about diabetes. Not because the other endocrine ailments are unimportant, but they're fairly rare. So we talk about Addison's disease, Cushing's syndrome, things of that nature, thyroid storm. It's not that you don't see them. It's pretty rare that you will see them in EMS. And even if you did see them, there's nothing we're going to be able to do about it. So let's focus on the source of a lot of confusion in the EMS world. We'll talk about diabetes. That'll be the biggest thing we're going to talk about in this video. But before that, nothing classified, nothing sensitive. A shout out to St. Louis, FBI, their op-ed division over there in St. Louis. Haven't been out to St. Louis yet. They were nice enough to send me this shirt. I can't thank them enough. That was very nice. But we are planning on going out to St. Louis, hopefully in 2021, to do a class. So I'm looking forward to that. That should be fun. Let's see, what else do we have as far as admin stuff? I think that's about it. Not a whole lot going on. COVID is COVID. It's doing its thing. I hope everybody's adapting well and not either going straight into alcoholism or divorce court, one or the other, or both. Hopefully that's not the case. Knock on wood, my wife and I are doing just fine. She's still bailing me out every chance she gets because Lord knows I need it. So let's get into it. Let's talk about diabetes and diabetic emergencies.
Hi, I'm Wilford Brimley, and I have diabetes. It hurts me to pee, and it causes me to be short with my family. I can't sleep at night. The other day, I stubbed my toe and took it out on the dog. And 2 weeks ago, I ran out of vanilla ice cream and struck my wife. And then I find out my wife's been dead for 6 years. Who the hell did I hit?
This message brought to you by the National Diabetes Association.
All right. Now, by no stretch of the imagination am I making fun of diabetes. So please don't misunderstand. It is a disease that afflicts, the last number I saw is almost 100 million people in the United States. It's tough. It's a tough disease. I count my blessings every day that I'm not afflicted with it, but I know family members who have it. I know a lot of people who have it. And it's one of those things where you're either born with it or you're not. And we're going to see that. We're going to talk about basically 4 different types of diabetes. And by no stretch of the imagination, again, am I an endocrinologist? I'm not an expert on diabetes. You really want to learn a lesson about diabetics and their day-to-day life. Go talk to a diabetic. And more specifically, go talk to a diabetic who is well educated in their disease. That's probably the best, because there are diabetics out there who just do not take care of themselves. They do not heed the warning of their doctors, their nutritionists, so on and so forth. They let themselves go, and they suffer the consequences. And these are sick patients, and these tend to be the ones that we find in EMS. Because we're also going to talk about the assessment of the diabetic patient. Most diabetic patients that we run across don't take care of themselves very well, either because they don't have a full understanding of their disease and how to manage it, or they're incapable of doing it, or their disease is starting to change on them, and they haven't wrapped their hands around how it's changed. So what we'll find a lot of is hypoglycemics, and again, we're gonna talk about that. So your different types of diabetes we're going to talk about. There's a type 1 diabetic, a type 2 diabetic, and then there's a gestational diabetic, and then there's an other category, or more your hyperglycemic type of diabetics. I shouldn't say diabetics, of type of ailments that a diabetic patient may suffer from. So we'll start off right out of the gate talking about the 4 different types of diabetes. But before we get into that, it's important for us to understand, how does our body metabolize food? We alluded to it in the first video. We talked about the pancreas, we talked about insulin, we talked about glucagon. Let's rehash that real quick and skim over it so that we're on the same sheet of music when it comes to how our body metabolizes foods. Let me throw this slide up. Right. It's all about the pancreas, quite frankly. It's all about managing our sugar levels in our body and how the pancreas does that. And the pancreas is the key player in this, make no mistake. We talked about the pancreas, we talked about Ancini glands, and the Ancini glands were more to produce digestive enzymes, which does play a role in diabetes. But the biggest thing we're really looking at are the islets of Langerhans. And the islets of Langerhans have your alpha cells, your beta cells, and your delta cells. Here specifically, we're going to talk about alpha-beta cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon, beta cells produce insulin. Let's summarize this a little bit further. Insulin is remember we talked about mediated transport mechanisms in pathophysiology, and we used insulin to glucose as an example. A cell only needs three things to survive. It needs sugar, needs water, needs oxygen. Here's the sugar, the complex carbohydrate part of the equation. So we eat breakfast, we eat lunch, we eat dinner, we eat whatever. Those sugars that we're consuming, those carbohydrates, proteins, however the body breaks it down. I'm not a nutritionalist, so we're not going to get too deep into the weeds on that. But we eat sugars. Any food is a sugar as far as we're concerned. Our body breaks it down, and it's insulin that takes that sugar and brings it across the cell membrane for the cell to be able to metabolize it and use it. Period. Without insulin, our body cannot use the sugar that we ingest. If our sugar levels get low and we're not eating, well, our body doesn't produce a lot of insulin because it doesn't need it. What it will start to produce then is glucagon, and glucagon is what comes from our alpha cells. Glucagon takes stored sugar cells, and we store sugar in the form of glycogen in our liver and in our major muscle groups. So we take that stored sugar and we will convert it through the utilization of glucagon and convert glycogen into glucose to maintain a blood sugar. Now you're going to see in this slide here, it talks about a homeostatic blood glucose level of 90 to 100. Okay, we usually use the range of 60 to 120. I think it's deciliters per milliliter or something like that. So on your glucose, on your glucometer that you have at your agency or wherever you may be, usually 60 to 120 is about the range. But I hate hard numbers because you may have patients that are at a blood glucose of 55 and be goofy as hell. They're a mess. And you may have patients who have a glucose level of 30 and they're fine. They just don't feel well. So it really all depends on the patient, quite frankly. But for the purposes of this discussion, the purposes of this video, we're going to say normal glucose level for us is 60 to 120. So let's go back to this slide. And the one little piece there labeled number 1, stimulus being, we just ate a cupcake, which looks delicious, quite frankly. All right, so we eat this cupcake. Now our sugar levels spike. Well, the body senses this. Remember, it's all a negative feedback mechanism. Remember, we talked about that in the last video. Well, among a dozen other things, the pancreas gets wind of this and says, ooh, all right, I have a whole lot of sugar in my system. Let me start pushing out some insulin because I have to now be able to utilize that sugar and bring it into the cells. Well, the cells only need so much. The cells aren't very gluttonous. The cells are going to take what they need and turn the rest away, essentially. Well, now you've got a lot of sugar floating around in your blood with nowhere to go. So the body doesn't want to waste it. All right? So what it does is it takes this sugar and it stores it in the liver and in your major muscle groups as glycogen. And it just sits there. And through a number of other mechanisms, what will end up happening is as the overflow of sugar gets greater and greater, now the body starts to store it in fat cells, adipose tissue, and we start to get fat. And it's much more to that. But that's the gist of it. So the body takes what it needs at the cellular level. It will absorb and store what it needs in the liver and in your major muscle groups. And it'll also start to store some of these sugars in your fat cells, right, or as fat. That's it in a nutshell, and that's how we keep our blood sugar at a certain level. Okay, scenario number 2 is you eat dinner tonight. Say you're old like me, and you're going to eat dinner at 4:30, 5 o'clock, all right? and you're going to be in bed by 9 o'clock, which is late for me, quite frankly. So the last time I had something to eat was 5 p.m. Well, now I don't wake up until 5 a.m. That's a 12-hour gap of time without me eating anything. Who knows the time frame? Somewhere, 2 o'clock in the morning, let's say, I have no idea, 3 o'clock in the morning, my body says, hey man, wow, you haven't eaten anything in a while, you got to be getting hungry, your blood sugar is dropping. So the body tells the pancreas, listen, don't produce any insulin because we do not need to burn up any more sugar. We have to hold on to what we've got. Let's start to secrete glucagon. So now the alpha cells start kicking in, glucagon is secreted. Glucagon goes to the liver and these major muscle groups, and they start to convert glycogen to glucose without us knowing about it. You know, we don't have to do a thing, which is kind of nice. And this maintains a blood sugar for us until we wake up. Now when we wake up, yeah, we may be hungry, but we're not hypoglycemic, right? Our blood sugar is not low. We're maintaining a normal blood sugar. And we go about our day. You know, we have our coffee, we have our breakfast, and life is good. So that's how the body processes food, one way or the other, or keeps our homeostatic blood sugar at a norm. So let me pull this slide down. So now that we have an understanding as to what happens when we eat something or what happens when we go a long period of time without eating something under normal circumstances. Normal circumstances being you're not a type 1 diabetic, you're not a type 2 diabetic. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a type 1 diabetic or an insulin-dependent diabetic. And you'll see it abbreviated, IDDM, insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus. Now, there's diabetes mellitus, which is a sugar diabetes, and then there is a diabetes insipidus, which is a water diabetes. Two completely different things. One has nothing to do with the other. But sometimes you'll hear people talk about diabetes insipidus. It's not diabetes in the sense of the word that we're talking about here. Diabetes insipidus is a lack of vasopressin in the kidneys. And what ends up happening is instead of the body saying, you know what, don't pee, your body urinates a lot, and it produces a lot of urine, which creates dehydration and thirst. And this is diabetes insipidus. This is not associated with diabetes mellitus. Two different things. So I just figured I'd get the semantics out of the way. So let's talk about type 1 diabetes first. Who gets it? Okay, it's not contagious. It's not a disease in that sense of the word. But your diabetes, your type 1 diabetic, your insulin-dependent diabetic, tends to be genetic. It tends to be from birth or very early on, your adolescent years, you tend to develop type 1 diabetes. And it is very complex. But think of it this way. Again, this is all about the pancreas. So for whatever reason, the pancreas produces way too little insulin or not any insulin at all. That's one way of thinking about it. So these people need insulin on a day-to-day basis for them to maintain their blood sugar levels. And here is where your newer diabetics, especially kids, have a hard time because you have to maintain, they have to understand their diet and what they're eating, when they're eating, do blood sugars throughout the day, manage how much insulin they get once a day, twice a day, whatever. Depending on the severity of their condition will dictate how they have to operate day to day. And every diabetic is a little different. It just depends on how sick they are. And I don't mean sick in the sense of the word that they're about to drop dead, not that kind of sick. But how severe their condition is will dictate how they operate day to day. We'll talk about insulin pumps a little bit later when we get into assessment and treatment. But let's look at type 1 diabetes for a second. This is just a quick picture to describe essentially what I just said. So now let's use the example of the cupcake. I eat the cupcake, and that cupcake is delicious. And now I've got all this sugar floating around in my bloodstream, but I have no insulin to carry it into the cell. So although I've got a ton of sugar in my body, it can't use it because I don't have that facilitator. I don't have the hormone insulin to then carry it across that cell wall. So this sugar sits in my bloodstream and I become hyperglycemic if I do not have the insulin to bring it into the cell. It's not to say wasted sugar, but it can't do anything. It's only in the presence of insulin that we can have that sugar cross over that barrier and into the cell. All right, so on the same line of thought, if this diabetic patient takes too much insulin, well, it's going to eat up every bit of that sugar, and now there's no sugar reserves for that patient to utilize when their sugar level starts to drop, and they can become hypoglycemic. And again, we'll get into that later. So type 1 diabetes is all about genetics. You're probably born with it, and you have to take outside insulin every day, maybe a number of times a day, to manage your blood sugar. So you're assuming the role of the beta cells of the pancreas from an external source, from a needle, from a pump, whatever. So that's type 1 diabetes. So let's put this next slide up. And type 2 diabetes. Your type 2 diabetic is a little different. When I say a little different, it typically affects patients later in life. And it's because of a number of different factors or some other outside variables. It's not genetic, type 2 diabetes. As a general rule, it's not genetic. Think of it this way. Your pancreas is engineered and designed by whatever or whomever you believe in. And this pancreas is engineered to support our body at a certain weight for a certain amount of time. That's really it. It's like a car, all right? A car is built and designed to function at a certain speed for a certain amount of years. With a little bit of maintenance, you can make that car last a lifetime. That's your pancreas. Well, if you abuse that car and you beat the crap out of that car and you don't maintain that car and you push it beyond its limits, what's going to happen? It's going to break down. It's going to fail. Well, that's your type 2 diabetic. Not every time, but for the most part. So here now we're talking about patients who are obese, people who have abused their body over the years, or they've outlived, so to speak, their pancreas. All right, they're getting up there in age, and maybe they beat their pancreas up a little bit too much when they were younger, and now the pancreas isn't functioning as well. So it's not that your pancreas is going to quit on you. Your pancreas just is not going to be able to perform nearly as well as it should, so it's going to produce less insulin. Therefore, you may need to take medications, micronase, glucophage, glucanase, glipizide. There's a number of different anti-hypoglycemics on the market. And when patients take these medications, these oral hypoglycemic agents, these are not sugar pills, as somebody once said to me. These are medications that essentially kick the pancreas in the ass and make the pancreas produce more, or make the pancreas be a bit more productive than it's already being. So you're physiologically, what's going on in your body, in your hyper versus hypoglycemic patient, insulin versus sugar, that same battle is occurring in type 1 diabetes as it is in type 2. Nothing's changed. It's just the etiology behind it. Your type 1 diabetic, your pancreas is producing probably zero insulin because it is a genetic issue, whereas your type 2 diabetic afflicts you later in life, where your pancreas may not be producing as much insulin as it should. So these are your non-insulin dependent diabetics, NIDDM, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, which is how it's abbreviated. So that's really your major difference between the two. Can they both be afflicted with hyper and hypoglycemia? Absolutely. We're going to get more into the weeds on TKA and HHNC here in just a little bit, but that's getting more into your hyperglycemic patients. But that's your type 1 versus your type 2 diabetic. So let me go ahead and just put this up as a recap as to what we're talking about. So this is what we mentioned before. Under normal circumstances, low blood glucose, high blood glucose. Pancreas is kicked into play. It's either producing glucagon or it's producing insulin. If we have a low blood glucose, glucagon is being produced. Why is it being produced? It's now stimulating the release of glycogen from your liver and your major muscle groups and keeping you at a normal blood glucose level. If your blood glucose is too high, you just fired down that cupcake. Well, your body is kicking in and it's producing a lot of insulin from your beta cells, and it's bringing that sugar into your cells for the cells to use and burn. Then it's going to store the rest of that sugar, whatever it doesn't need, in your liver, in your major muscle groups, and in fat cells to maintain a certain blood glucose. That's what we have going on. That's diabetes in a nutshell. So this slide here just gives you an overview of type 1 versus type 2. And that's what we've already discussed. Usually your type 1 diabetics are more genetic. You'll find them to be a little younger. Your type 2 diabetics tend to be older. Maybe they've partied a little too hard. Maybe they're a little obese. Maybe their diet really is crap. So it just depends. Your type 1 diabetes requires insulin from the outside source, so they're an insulin-dependent diabetic. Your type 2 diabetic is non-insulin dependent. They will take an oral hypoglycemic agent. There are some diabetics who will take both. I think I've actually heard them referred to as a diabetic 1.5 or 2.5, I don't know, something to that extent. But don't be surprised if you see a patient who takes both. They take an oral hypoglycemic agent and insulin. It just depends on the patient. So that's just a quick recap of diabetes. Let me pull this down. So when we look at diabetes as a whole, it's all about the pancreas. It's all about sugar. How is that sugar getting in and out of your bloodstream?
Oompa-loompa-dee-doo, I've got a perfect puzzle for you. Oompa-loompa-doompa-dee.
Can't go wrong with Willy Wonka. I don't think there's actually little Oompa Loompas in our body dumping sugar into our bloodstream and pulling it out. But I digress. I didn't like the new Willy Wonka with what's his name, Johnny Depp. I didn't care for that one. That was a little freakish as far as I was concerned. I like the original one with Gene Wilder. That was a good one. For those of you who have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Good movie. All right. So let's move on, and let's make sure we're staying on track. We talked about type 1 diabetes. We've talked about type 2 diabetes. How do we assess them? How do we treat them? All right, well, it's really pretty simple, quite frankly. The only affliction of diabetes that we can do anything about, quite frankly, is hypoglycemia. So here's the scenario. I don't care if you're a type 1 diabetic. I don't care if you're a type 2 diabetic. Let's talk about the type 1 diabetic as an example. Here's your standard scenario. They wake up in the morning. They're in a rush. They take their insulin, and they don't eat anything. Like, I'm in a rush. I'm running late. Let me just take my insulin. Let me run out the door and go do what I have to do, and I'll eat when I get there. Okay, good plan. Well, they take their insulin. They run out the door. Now they get stuck in traffic. Now they get to work. And they go down, boom, hard. They go unconscious. They look like they're having a stroke. Strike that. Some patients may look like they're having a stroke. Your hypoglycemic patient is afflicted quickly. They'll go from normal to all of a sudden looking at you with this sort of a glazed over face to unconscious in the span of 5 minutes. It's amazing how fast it hits them. They'll also suffer from altered mental status, depending on the patient. Some patients may just go down hard and go unconscious. Other patients may get nasty. They suffer from being hangry. Okay, you see the Snickers commercials. Perfect example that I love to tell people about is the elderly gentleman in Florida in a beautiful beachside condominium. Gorgeous, big money. We walk in for the altered mental status, your very standard altered mental status call you get. So myself, my partner, an engine company, so there's 5 or 6 of us there, police are there. We make our way into this condominium. Again, beautiful, very well-kept house, nothing dilapidated, ocean view, beautiful. And there's this old man. He's got to be 70-some-odd years old, squaring off with us. He's got his, "Come on, you mother," and he's cursing at us. He wants to go. Whoa, easy, Jack. Take it easy. We're here to help you. But you can see that he wasn't quite right. You can see that he was beaten up with sweat. Something wasn't really right with this guy. So we end up figuring out, we looked in his refrigerator real quick. We saw some insulin syringes. We saw some medication bottles in the kitchen. And we pieced it together very quickly. Okay, he's a diabetic. He's probably hypoglycemic. So we grabbed this guy. We wrestled him to the ground. He is fighting us, cursing at us. I mean, things came out of his mouth that you wouldn't even make up from a movie. Well, as we're wrestling with him, this little lady comes, because it's Florida and they're retired, so they're all nosy. That's what they do. This little lady comes to the door. She peeks around the corner and she says, "Oh my goodness, is everything all right?" I said, "Yes, ma'am, everything's fine. We're just taking care of your neighbor here. We'll be out of your way in a little bit. Will you just let us know if there's anything we can do for Father Bob?" I said, "Father Bob?" Now the whole time this guy's, "Fuck you." And he's mean, nasty. We're like, "This is Father Bob?" And so, "Oh yeah, he's the parish priest." "Oh yeah?" Father Bob's got a few skeletons rattling around in that closet. Well, sure enough, as soon as we treated him, we gave him some D50 at the time. We'll talk about treatments here in a little bit. Bing! His eyes open up. He looks around. "Oh, gentlemen. Oh, my goodness. Oh, dear. I must have forgotten to eat." Yeah. "Oh, dear, my ass." You got some shit going on in there. But that's how you can have that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde just from sugar levels. And what ended up happening a lot of times in the law enforcement world is back in the day, police officers used to find somebody on the street drunk and obnoxious and abusive, and they'd take him, they'd throw him in a drunk tank, let him sleep it off. The guy would wake up in the morning sober, and they'd kick him out. Well, what they found in a couple of instances is they would find this drunk on the street, they grab him, throw him in the drunk tank, let him sleep it off, come back to check on him the next morning, and he's laying there dead. He wasn't drunk, he was hypoglycemic. And when they threw him in the drunk tank and left him alone, his sugar levels dropped so low that he died. I had an NYU student years ago when I was working in New York. He committed suicide by taking his roommate's insulin. He kind of did it right. He laid there in a bed with candles lit and music playing, and he had a suicide note, and he injected all of his roommate's insulin, and he laid down, went to sleep. That was it. That's all she wrote. So that's how profound hypoglycemia can be. You can die from it, and it can affect you very quickly. So any blood sugar below 60 is considered hypoglycemia, and your patient presentation can be anywhere, from a little confused, disoriented, to completely unconscious, and they look like they're having a stroke. So everything in between can be the way this patient presents, but usually, again, it hits that patient pretty quickly. Versus hyperglycemia. Let's go back to that original patient. Here's a patient running late, didn't take their insulin. They grab a bagel, they grab a banana, they grab a muffin, run out the door, they're eating it on the way. They get to work, and now they feel like crap. They just don't feel good. They're now suffering from hyperglycemia because now the body can't utilize the sugars, the muffin, the banana, the bagel. It can't utilize those sugars. Those sugars are floating around in their bloodstream, but it cannot be used by the body. So how does your body compensate for that? Well, your body's pretty slick. It'll start to utilize its own sugars by the release of glucagon. But if their pancreas is so affected, maybe the glucagon isn't going to work. Or what it'll do is it'll turn to fat. Remember we talked about fat before, adipose. So now the body is going into a little bit of panic mode, saying, "Ooh, we got plenty of sugar here, but we can't utilize it." Well, let's start to break down fat for fuel, because the body needs fuel. Carbohydrates and sugars, those are fuel for the body. So the body's going into panic mode, and it starts to turn to fat and break down fat to maintain that energy level. Well, a byproduct of this are ketone bodies, or keto acids. So now these keto acids are being produced in the body, slowly but surely, and over time, days, quite frankly, of this not being corrected, of someone not taking insulin, their body burning fat for fuel, they will now turn ketoacidotic and go into hyperglycemia, or such a profound hypoglycemia that they now start to suffer the effects. These patients don't go unconscious right away. That's not what they do. But what ends up happening is these acid levels build up. I remember from pathophysiology, we talked about acids not being good. So the pH is dropping, acids are going up. How does the body compensate? Well, they start to breathe hard and fast. These are called Cushings respirations. They're breathing hard, breathing fast, trying to blow off these ketone bodies or these keto acids. Some people have described the smell as an acetone smell. Me personally, the handful of times, 2 off the top of my head that I remember, the times I smelled their breath, to me, it smelled like juicy fruit gum. That's just me. That's how I interpreted the smell. So much so that I thought my partner had juicy fruit gum. And I was pestering him for a piece when we got to the ER, and he thought I was crazy. I said, come on, give me a piece of gum. He goes, I don't have any gum. What's the matter with you? You're crazy. I said, I can smell the gum. It was the patient's breath. These hyperglycemic patients, as they slip into what's called DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, these are patients that have produced no insulin. Their body's blood sugar is really going up. The body cannot utilize the sugars that are floating around in their bloodstream, and they turn to fat over time, days, and this fat breakdown, all these keto acids produce DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis. They become very dry, very dehydrated, and their respiratory effort gets high. These Kussmaul's respirations, smells like juicy fruit. But they produce a lot of urine, and they go through what's called a hyperosmolar state. So remember now, going back to diffusion and osmosis, let's imagine, if you will, this is not true, but follow me down this rabbit hole. Let's imagine now that we have too much sugar in our bloodstream. Well, now our blood becomes thick like syrup. It doesn't turn thick like syrup, right? But just follow me down this rabbit hole. Now your blood becomes thick like syrup. So where is the hypertonic solution? Inside the blood vessel or in the interstitial space outside the blood vessel? It's inside. Your blood is very thick. The body doesn't like this. So what the body is going to do is it's going to pull via osmosis. It's going to pull fluids from your tissue into your bloodstream to try and dilute this thick blood. All right? Well, diffusion can't take place because your glucose molecules are too fat. You can't get to the other side of that blood vessel. It's too super dense. So now all this blood eventually makes its way to the kidneys. So what ends up happening is at the kidney level, well, we have a lot of water now in your blood, so the kidneys start to pull this water out of your blood, and you end up peeing a lot. So you go through a hyperosmolar diuresis, and this dehydrates your patient. So now you're pulling fluid away from tissue, which is dehydrating them. You're urinating like crazy, increasing that dehydration, and they can start to slip into a type of diabetic ketoacidosis, and part of that is dehydration, hyperosmotic type of a condition. How do we know all this is going on? Quite frankly, we don't. We may check a blood sugar on this unconscious, unresponsive patient, and these DKA patients don't go unconscious, unresponsive right away. It takes days for them to go unconscious, whereas your hypoglycemic patient, they go out unconscious in a matter of minutes. So 2 different animals. Your hypoglycemic patient is dripping with sweat, look like they're about to die. Your hyperglycemic patient is breathing very fast, fruity acetone breath, and they're dry. You check the hypoglycemic blood sugar, it's going to either read low, LO, on your glucometer, depending on how it's configured and how it's calibrated, or it'll be below 60. Or you check your blood sugar in your hyperglycemic patient, way above 120, or it may read high, HI, on your glucometer, depending on how it's configured and calibrated. Those are your big differences. How do you treat your hypoglycemic patient? Well, they need sugar, and we'll talk about how to treat them in a second. How do you treat your hyperglycemic patient? Well, they need insulin. Pre-hospitally, we don't give insulin. Are they dehydrated, though? Yeah, they need fluids. Go ahead and give them some fluids, give them a liter, but of course watch their lung sounds and make sure there's no other concomitant cardiac conditions. But this is your major difference in hypo versus hyperglycemia. So let me put this slide up here for a second, and we're going to talk about something a little outside the box. So here we have DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis. So Kussmaul's breathing, they could suffer from nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, fatigue, thirst, all right, because they're becoming dehydrated. They may have that acetone breath. They may go completely unconscious. They may not. They may start to become hypotensive, maybe not. Your DKA patient is pretty rare to find. Again, in 32 years, I think I've seen 6 full-blown, genuine, no bullshit DKA patients. You don't see them that often. But you can run into a condition known as HHNS or HHNC, hyperosmolar hyperglycemic non-ketotic syndrome or non-ketotic coma. Depends on what book you read. That's a mouthful. Let's break it down. Hyperosmolar hyperglycemic non-ketotic syndrome. Hyperosmolar. We talked about that. Their blood is getting very, very thick. Now, the osmolarity, going back to pathophysiology, the osmolarity of the blood is becoming such that it's drawing fluid from the interstitial space. It's becoming hyperosmolar, which is going to draw fluid in from tissue. Hyperglycemic, all right? Their blood sugar is very high. We know this. Non-ketotic. Okay, here's a little different. Non-ketotic. These are your hyperglycemic patients that are producing just enough insulin. So you tend to see DKA in your type 1 diabetics, but you tend to see the HHNC, or your HHS in this slide, patients in your type 2 diabetics, because they're producing just enough insulin to keep them from breaking down the degree and the amount of fat to put them into such a profound ketoacidosis that they're producing these Kussmaul's respirations. So the one thing that an HHNC patient is going to lack versus a DKA patient is Kussmaul's breathing, because their ketone levels are not that high where they have to blow it off in a compensatory mechanism. So that's HHS or hyperosmolar, hyperglycemic, non-ketotic coma. So to put them both side by side, DKA and HHNC, the only difference you're really going to see in your patient presentation is one is going to have Kussmaul's respirations, that's your DKA patient, and one is not. That's really it. Maybe I've seen 2 of these in my career. Again, it's not something you're going to see very often, quite frankly. In the pre-hospital environment, you don't see it very often. Treatment is the same, whether it's DKA or HHNS or HHS in this slide. Fluids, and get them to a hospital. They need insulin. That's what they need. That's the key to success. So when we look at any one of these conditions, it's all, again, about that sugar level and how do we maintain our sugar level.
I can't. Falling now.
If you find anything that doesn't look like fecal remnant.
I want the entire pool scrubbed, sterilized, and disinfected. Here it is.
Oh.
It's no big deal.
Oh.
Now, for those of you who remember Caddyshack, right, he's eating a candy bar there, so we'll just use that as a sugar level. So, the assessment, and let's do a quick recap here. The assessment we talked about, your hypoglycemic. Now, so in the grand scheme of things, do I care if somebody's a type 1 or a type 2 diabetic right out of the gate? Quite frankly, no. It's how they present is how I'm going to treat them. So in your patient presentation, somebody goes down hard fast. They're dripping with sweat. They look like they're about to die. They look, quite frankly, a lot of times like they're having a stroke. They can even have seizures depending on how low that blood sugar goes. If you have the means to check a blood sugar, check it. If they have a medical alert tag on, check it. It may say type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. That'll give you a clue. Should you ever put food or glucose paste or juice or sugar, anything in someone's mouth if they're unconscious? And the answer really is no, you shouldn't, because now they run the risk of aspiration. Are there situations where you can take some glucose paste? If you're really monitoring their airway and you have them turned in such a way to where you're going into the buccal route, and you're allowing for drainage, and there's no way for them to aspirate, could that sugar absorb via the buccal route and you not worry about aspiration? Yeah, but you really got to be comfortable in your own skin to do that. In the absence of treating them at the BLS level with glucose paste, if you don't have it, and they're unconscious, just maintain their airway, call 911, and as soon as 911 shows up, they'll be able to take care of it in 5 minutes. It doesn't take anything at all to take care of it. If you have a patient who's just stuporous, confused, combative, agitated, whatever, glucose paste is perfect. Orange juice with a couple of tablespoons of sugar in it, perfect. But that only lasts so long. They need some sustenance in their gut, in a peanut butter sandwich, something hearty for them to eat, for them to maintain their sugar level until they can either take their insulin or take their medications or get themselves in check. So the assessment goes back to assessment 101. Airway, breathing, circulation, maintain their airway, make sure they don't aspirate, but protect yourself, be careful. Think about my little priest who was whooping the shit out of 4 or 5 of us. They can become combative, and it's not in their nature, but it's just the way it is until you get their sugar levels back up. We used to give dextrose 50% or D50 via IV, which was essentially syrup in a syringe that we push into the IV, and it would bring their blood sugar up just like that. And you see a night and day difference through the IV. A lot of systems are getting away from D50, and now they're going to D10, dextrose 10% in a IV drip form versus an IV push. I have mixed emotions about that. The science, I shouldn't even say the science, the theory is by giving D50, you're increasing their blood sugar too much too quickly, and it's going to create problems. Okay, whereas the D10 is a little more of a gradual increase in sugar level, blood serum level. It's not as traumatic to the body, and just as effective. Yeah, I've worked under both protocols. I've pushed D50 and I've pushed D10. They both work. It's just a matter of how much on-scene time you want. D10 just takes a little longer to infuse, that's all. But what if you're an ALS provider and you can't get an IV? All right, glucagon is a good treatment. Glucagon 1 milligram IM. Now we wouldn't give it IV, because if we had an IV, we can give the D10 or the D50. So a lot of your diabetics have very poor circulation. You just can't get a line in them. So you'll end up giving glucagon IM 1 milligram. But that takes about 10 minutes for it to really kick in. Because now what you're doing is you are assuming the role of the pancreas, and you're assuming the role of those alpha cells, and you're giving the body glucagon so that it can go to the liver, so it can go to the muscle groups, break down glycogen, convert it to glucose, and bring the blood serum level up. It takes a little bit of time. But if you have a bad alcoholic whose liver is shot, somebody who has liver disease, somebody who's malnutrition, suffering from malnutrition, they have no glycogen stores, glucagon isn't going to work. So you got to look at your patient and take that with a grain of salt. So those are your major treatments for your hypoglycemic patient. That's where we have the most effect, is in our hypoglycemic population. We can treat them on scene very easily, very safely, and a lot of times they don't want to go to the hospital afterwards. They know what they need to do because they're lifetime diabetics, so they understand. Your hyperglycemic patients, there's not much we really can do other than give fluids and get them to the hospital. Your DKA and HHNC patients, those are your hyperglycemic patients. There's nothing we can do for them. On that same note, we'll just touch on gestational diabetes real quick because this is fairly easy. That's your 4th category of diabetic. Gestational diabetes is a young lady that's pregnant, again, versus a young man who's pregnant. Young lady who's pregnant and now they develop diabetes. That's it. They suffer from diabetes while they're pregnant. And once the baby is born, very soon after the baby is born, their diabetes goes away and they go back to how they were before. I couldn't tell you exactly why or how this all happens. It's pretty wild, but it is what it is. These patients tend to have bigger babies, larger babies. So if you have a mom in front of you that you're assessing and she's in labor and she's a gestational diabetic, ask mom, how big is the baby? She may say, oh, it's a 10-pounder, it's an 11-pounder, and she's a little bitty thing. That baby isn't being delivered naturally. You got to start going to the hospital quickly. You ain't delivering that baby on scene. It's probably going to be a C-section. So something to think about. All right, let me get on track here and make sure we're good. We're right about the time we need to be. Thyroid storm is an overactive thyroid gland. You'll see people with these big eyeballs, ophthalmosis, I think it's called, or something to that effect. I always mispronounce it. High blood pressure, tachycardia. It could kill them. A thyroid storm could genuinely kill someone. But again, there's nothing we can do about it other than recognize that they may be in a thyroid storm. It's very hard to find for us personally, unless the patient knows this, and get them to a hospital. You have Cushing's syndrome and you have Addison's disease, both an affliction of the adrenal gland. Cushing's syndrome is an increased corticosteroid level being secreted, whereas your Addison's disease is a decreased corticosteroid level. There's moon face and there's all these other different physical characteristics that you may see in your patient to dictate one or the other. Nothing we can do about it. Get into a hospital. Chances are they know. And one thing I did want to put up here, I almost forgot. I wanted to show you what an insulin pump looks like. This is one of maybe, 24 manufacturers of insulin pumps that are out there. There are diabetics out there now that have their diabetes so dialed in, they are in such control of it, that these insulin pumps are sensitive to their metabolic needs. They know exactly what to eat, when to eat it. This pump will secrete exactly the amount of insulin the patient needs based on a metabolic demand. Some of them are that scientifically dialed in, others not so much. When these first came out, it was like a diabetic MCI. There were patients dropping all over the place because they couldn't regulate the amount of insulin that these pumps were secreting, and your patients were constantly going hypoglycemic. But now technology being what it is, these are really, really great devices, and it's made it to where a diabetic patient has a really high quality of life. So if you end up seeing one of these things on someone's belt, it's not a beeper. This isn't the 80s and the 90s anymore. This is an insulin pump. And these are the patients who, again, listen to your patients. They know their diabetes. They know what they need to do. They're typically very dialed in. All right, let me check my notes. We cover diabetes in a nutshell. Type 1, type 2, gestational, and other, being hyperglycemic. We talked about hypo and hyperglycemia. We talked about DKA and HHNC. Really the only one we can have any effect on is your hypoglycemic patient. The BLS level is glucose paste. ALS level is D50 or D10 or glucagon IM. That's really about it. Your normal blood glucose is 60 to 120. Anything above 120 plus is hyperglycemic. Anything 60 or below is hypoglycemic. It's all about insulin. It's all about sugar. That's diabetes in a nutshell. We'll call it quits here. We're at about the 50-minute mark. Diabetes is very, very complicated, but it doesn't have to be difficult for us to understand pre-hospitally. It's follow your local protocols on what you can and can't do. Assess your patients well, and you'll be fine. That is endocrine part 2. That's diabetes. We will follow this video up. I'm not sure if I'm going to do neuro next or not, but we'll see. It's probably going to be neurology, but we'll see which one I pull out of my hat. Code word for my FBI folk, let's keep it consistent, sugar. All right, sugar, that makes sense. So for FBI personnel, code word for video number 17 is sugar. That's it from me. Have a great day. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you soon. Be well.